Hello guys, welcome to part 2 of the advanced / updated Ortho4XP tutorial. Last year I showed you guys how to get flat runways from Ortho4XP scenery to have something of an accurate elevation profile. However, it's been some time since I put that tutorial together and I've discovered a new tool and some new techniques using wave profiles that can enable the creation of more detailed and accurate elevation profiles on your runways when compared to the real world. Welcome to Ali on Games. I am Ali and today I will be showing you a tool and some techniques that can take your runways to having some sexy curves. In this video, I'll be showing you a tool I found on the map developer's website called the Elevation Calculator. I'll also be showing you what wave profiles are and what they do in JOSM when it comes to creating your patch file. And then we'll take a look at before and after when comparing the techniques that I showed you last year and the techniques that I now use today for my patch files and my scenery. If you've never seen JOSM before and don't know what a patch file is, or perhaps never created one for your scenery in the past, please refer to the basics video on the topic for additional insight, as some of the information in this video might not make quite so much sense without additional context. The link for this video is in the description below. Assuming that you have watched that video before, and or know what you're doing with patch file creation, let's get stuck in. Okay guys, so as I said, the first thing I was going to show you was the new elevation calculator that I use to get information for runway profiles. But I thought first of all I would obviously kind of compare and explain why I moved to this tool. Now what you can see in front of you here is the altitude.nu website that I showed you last year. I used this for a good amount of time and I found it particularly useful when it came to being able to get the altitude at any given point that I clicked. Fantastic for that. As you know, I used to use meter markers, so whenever a meter had passed, I would use that as a plot point. And obviously, depending on the spacing of these points, that would affect whether or not they were in their own zone, or whether I break them up into 2 or 3 different zones, and I would try to assume the character of a gradient based upon the spacing of those indicators, if that makes any sense. I did go over all of this in the previous video. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what I will say is what was missing from this was a kind of a visual representation. Now, there are some people who can just look at data and essentially visualize based upon the data that they're looking at a graphical, like a graph in their head or a pie chart or something. I'm quite like a visual, like I have a good imagination. I'm quite a visual triggered guy, but when it comes to this, I was kind of really unable to try and fit in the shape of curves and gradients in my head. So I went in search of something else, and I found this. This is on the mapdevelopers.com website, and it's called the Elevation Calculator. I will be putting this link up here in the description below so that you can get access to it straight away. Now there are some flaws with this, but overall, for how I like to use the tool, I don't really see them as flaws, because I just seem to be able to get I get a visual representation of the gradients that I'm trying to map, and I'm also able to, I guess, tailor it to how I want to use it. So I'm going to show you the different ways that this can be used and exactly how it works. So I'm going to, for the purposes of the demonstration, we're going to stick to Jersey so that we can have a comparison between this year's and last year's techniques of creating this content. So basically what you do is, well, basically what this tool does is you can go anywhere in the world. Okay, so let's forget about Britain for now. We'll go to Spain. You can click somewhere there, and you get a graph pop up at the bottom. And between those 2 points, this is a visual representation of what happens with the elevation of the, of the land that you've selected there over that distance. It's quite cool. And of course, if you wanted a slightly higher resolution sort of snapshot, you could go in closer, take a smaller area, and you get slightly more, higher resolution curves. The only flaw I found with this tool is the fact that this graph here does not scale to the distance that you're trying to cover. So if I were to do this, so let's take this entire runway. So if I were to go from one point of a runway to another, I get that graph. Now, you can kind of see what the runway is doing there, right? You can see that it starts off about 82.5 and kind of drops down. This is from right to left, by the way. This is where my first point was. This is where my second point was. So, and then it's like 0.1's on the left of the graph, 0.2 is on the right. It drops down. It stays kind of flat, a bit bumpy, and then it goes right back up again to around about 83.7 or something. You can actually click and it will tell you. So it's 83.8. You can click anywhere here and it will tell you the altitude at that given area. And then it comes back down again, it goes back up. So you can kind of get an idea as to what the character of the runway is doing. Now, if I wanted to, I could map this in one. So I could have like a flat zone there in JOSM. I could have a climbing zone here up to about here in JOSM. A resolution flat zone here. Coming back down to here, flatten it out here, and then a climb again. Resolution and a descent. I could probably get it done in about 7 or 8 zones. Easy, right? But for me, and now I know that's how some people will use this, and that's perfectly fine. If they want to get a gist of the character of the runway that they're doing, perfect. Especially if they're not particularly confident with using loads and loads and loads of tiny little zones to actually make the runway as accurate as they can compared to, obviously, the real world representation. However, what I like to do is I like to try and get as much detail as possible. This is why I kind of started this whole project of trying to cover the world's runways in Ortho4XP, and as well as obviously cover it with photo scenery for my simulator. I want detail, consistently good detail, regardless of where I'm landing. Now, that can come down to the assets for the airport, like, the aerodrome scenery. It could come down to obviously the photo scenery, but for me it also comes down to the runway. A lot of people are very happy with flat runways. I'm not. I kind of think that the landing and the taking off shouldn't feel the same each and every single time. You should have a challenge there. I mean, in the real world, pilots, they learn their runways. Like the more they do service routes, and the more they kind of get to grips with how airports operate and how the runways behave and stuff like that. They have a strategy in their head as to where they want to touch down to make the most efficient landing possible. Take Birmingham, for example. Birmingham's airport is quite an oscillating runway. Birmingham, it kind of goes up and down, it rolls for ages. And you want to try and catch the right point of a rolling oscillation like that to make sure that you don't screw up the landing. And I like those kind of challenges. So I'm trying to capture as much as I can in the runways to make sure that I'm not necessarily looking for a challenge in every single runway, but at least I'm wanting to know the runway. I want to know the airport. I want to know the runway. And I want to know how it behaves so that I can educate myself in that respect and have a different experience landing from one runway to the next, other than just the approach pattern being different and maybe the length of the runway. You understand what I mean? So how I use this is instead of making like one long line that goes from start to finish like I did before, I like to kind of just go from... I want to take a little area. Okay, now this is a fantastic example of what I was about to say. So this is like this here, like obviously I've used the line on a smaller area, and as I said, one of the flaws with this website and this tool is the fact that the graph does not scale with the amount of area that you're trying to cover, which means if you're covering a smaller area with the measuring tool here, you get higher resolution data. I see a curve there. Whereas I didn't see that before. I just saw a change in altitude. You know what I mean? Sorry, change in elevation. I didn't see how that change of elevation actually happened, what the character of the incline was. Now I do. Now I see that it's almost straight. I mean, I could call this little area here straight, and then it swoops down, almost like a ski jump slope. Almost. Kind of. Minus the flick up at the end. And then it kind of levels off. And now if I were to click here and add another point, I will extend that reading. And then click there. Obviously it gets longer and longer and longer. And if I ever feel like, okay, wait a minute, I will probably do a flat area here, I can just go back a couple of points and find that flat area. There we go, perfect. Now I know from start to finish how big I want that incline zone to be, so that I can mark the zones at a start and a finish point in the right place in JOSM. You know what I mean? So as best I can, when it comes to using this tool, I kind of essentially mark the distance zone to zone. I never just take a whole snapshot of the runway and then go at it. I remember when I first found this tool, I did used to do that, and I got some horrible results because I was guessing. I mean, if you look here, I'll get the full runway again. Now I could guess where all of this, because obviously that line is huge, right? And that graph isn't particularly clear. I mean, there's no visual, like when I kind of I guess scrub across with my cursor here all the altitudes, I don't get a visual representation up here as to where on this line I am, so I don't know where to start and end my zones. Whereas if I go zone by zone, not only do I get much higher resolution data, I know where the start and finish of my inclines and my flat areas and the kind of inclines that they are. I know where they start and end, so I know where to put my zones at. Like, I know where to start my zones and to end my zones in JOSM. By the way, again, a reminder, if you do not know what I mean when I'm on about zones, please watch the basics video that I made last year regarding creating a patch file in JOSM. The link for it is down below the stream. Sorry, down below the video. Jesus, I'm not streaming right now. But yeah, the main perk of this is the way I use it. I can take a small area and I can get a lot of information here. I can see a lot of information. Now, you can capture as little or as much of that as you like. I personally would make a flat. I would probably put this entire area here, for example, flat up until here. So about 82.5. I'd find the middle part of this slope here and I go, okay, 82.5. This entire area I'll put as 82.5. And then I'll take it and I'll slope it down. Do another little flat area, I'll slope it up. But of course, these slopes have characters. And the important thing is to be able to capture the correct kind of incline so that you can best represent the runway as accurate as you can to the real world counterpart in your sim. So how do we get those shapes? How do we get the different kinds of inclines? How do we get the smooth round edges? How do we get like you know, like what we got earlier? How do we get inclines like these? Because if we go by the tutorial that I did last year, all we can do is make straight lines. So we either have flat or incline, but there's no slope so much, if you understand what I mean. This is more of a slope. It's a progressive incline. It changes the angle of its descent, changes the further down the slope that you get. Okay guys, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to how to actually replicate those slightly more advanced kinds of slopes. As you saw in the elevation calculator, some inclines aren't just straight lines. Some of them, they slope properly. They're kind of like, some of them look a little bit like rolling hills. Some of them look a little bit like ski slopes, you know. And we want to be able to kind of capture them as best as we can, so that we can have smooth transitions from gradients to flat areas of a runway back to gradients again, and there's nothing too jarring going on. So we're trying to capture a little bit more of the authentic character and feel of the runways using these following tools. And these tools are called way profiles. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is they're not particularly hard to implement, and there is a degree of creative interpretation as to which ones you use or whether or not you decide to use any at all. But what I'm going to do is tell you the functions that you can use to be able to create slope characteristics that you do choose to use when you choose to use them. The first one I'm going to talk about is called the spleen profile, or the spline profile, or however you say that word that's on your screen right now. I've heard people say it both ways, and I really have not got a clue which one it's supposed to be. Essentially, as you can see, is it slopes on both the high and the low. and it's really quite it's a good one to use because it starts off at the altitude high, if you want to call it. If you're on the high point, it starts off flat and then slowly rounds off and then progressively gets more aggressive with its rounding off until it gets to about halfway down the incline, rounds itself off to become flat again on the low part of the incline. So it's like horizontal to horizontal with a kind of a nice rolling hill in the middle of it. And the way that you implement this is very similar to how you would implement a normal incline. So you have your key for altitude high, and then the value in meters, as we've always done. Altitude low, then the value in meters again. Cell size, and then the value. Of course, the bigger that number, the lesser number of triangles are going to be used to create the curve, which means it might not be quite as smooth as you would like. The lower the number, the more triangles are dedicated to using the curve, and so you get a much smoother, rounded transition in the gradient itself. It's entirely up to yourself what you want to use. You don't have to use any of them, but I always put a cell size in of 2 because I just found that it always works very well for me. The final parameter that you need to be able to create this shape in your runway is a way profile. And so in the key section in JOSM, you would type in where you would usually type in altitude high or altitude low. You instead type in the word profile, and then in the value field you type in the word spleen. And what that does is when Ortho4XP reads it, it takes the altitude high and the altitude low values and obviously sets them up as it would in an incline. And then it looks at the way profile and it goes, oh, okay, so that kind of shape has to happen between those 2 points. And so it adds that spleen character to the incline. And as I said, it just looks a little bit more authentic. It looks a little bit more like a runway style kind of oscillating shape like you get in the transitions or gradients on a runway. A little bit more rounded and curved as opposed to angular like we've been doing since the techniques I showed you last year. So that's the spleen profile. That's how to implement it, and I will show you a couple of examples of it in action later on in this video. Now the second profile I'm going to tell you about is one that I don't know if I'm saying properly. It's called ATAN, well I call it ATAN-H. A-T-A-N-H. It's on your screen right now. Say it how you will. Doesn't really bother me. Now this one is similar to the spleen profile, however, where the spleen profile is dominantly curved, the ATAN-H profile is dominantly straight and flat, much like a normal incline that you would have done just using the altitude high, altitude low, and cell size parameters, that straight line one. But the only difference between that and the ATAN-H profile is that the ends of the incline are rounded slightly, so that the transition between your resolution zone, where it's just a fixed altitude on either side of an incline zone, is rounded. It's more smoother. It's more aggressive, of course, than using the spleen profile, but it's not as aggressive as a sudden change in gradient that you would have done without using a profile at all, like in the videos I showed you last year. It just makes the whole experience of going from, transitioning from one character in the runway to an incline back to a flat area a little bit less jarring, especially if you're in a GA aircraft. The way I was doing runways last year without using these way profiles, sometimes I would land in a Cessna and it would seem a little bit kind of angly, you know, it's like, oh, it's straight, oh, now it's not straight, now it's straight, now it's not straight, whereas this is rounded, and you go, oh, I'm going down a hill now, okay, and it's a nice kind of smooth transition into that. So it's very similar to how you've always done your inclines, but the entrance and exit from these incline zones into your resolution zones or into any flat areas are just a little bit more flattened, you know, because runways are, they're made to be as flat as possible. It's never always perfect. There is an element of forgiveness when it comes to changing gradients in real world runways, and that's exactly what this allows you to capture as well, that sort of forgiveness. The feeling that this runway, before it was laid, there was attempts to make it as flat as possible. They've rounded off all the harsh parts, and then of course they put down the tar, the asphalt, and there's your runway. That's what this is kind of giving. But again, it's not quite as, rounded and as nice as a spleen profile, but it allows you to have a slightly more of an aggressive incline without you actually jarring your plane too much. So that's the A-tan-H profile, and it is executed in almost exactly the same way as the spleen. So you have the altitude high, the altitude low, and of course the relevant values in meters. You also have the cell size, which of course affects the rounded areas on each side as to how smooth and how round they are. And then of course you have the profile, and the value of that profile being A-tan-H. Now there is one other parameter that you can use, and it can only be used with the A-tan-H profile. It is a key called steepness. And the value that you use with the steepness key is any real number. And I'm going to be very honest with you, I'm not entirely sure what this one does. So I actually asked Oscar on the Ortho4XP forum, and this is the reply that he gave me. I'm going to let you sit with it for about 30 seconds or so to read it. And if you can work it out, you are a significantly more intelligent person than I am, because I got really confused. And when I use it to test how the steepness variable works, I still get confused because I don't really see the differences. And if I do see the differences, I'm not entirely sure what differences I'm seeing, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to leave you to read that for a second. Hopefully you can read it and take it in better than I have. But if you guys can work out what this answer says, then use it and you'll probably have better runways than I do. So yeah, that is the A-tan-H profile. And that brings us on to the final profile that I'm going to talk about, which is called the parabolic profile. Parabolic profile is probably best represented by that first curve shape that we saw when I first showed you the elevation calculator. The one that I said looked a little bit like a ski slope. If you were to compare this to the spleen profile, you could say that it's exactly like a spleen minus the curve on the high point. So it's like straight slope. Slope and then rounded on the altitude low, on the low point. And yes, I do use this one because there are some times where you look at the elevation calculator and you go, wow, that really isn't a rounded entrance to that gradient, but it does round off nicely at the bottom. If I use a spleen here, that would seem a little bit too forgiving. I'm going to use a parabolic profile. And again, you implement this in exactly the same way as the other two. Altitude high, altitude low, and the relevant values in meters for both of those points. Cell size, which of course affects the roundedness and the resolution of that, the transition itself with the slope. And then of course the profile key once again, with the value of that being parabolic. Make sure you spell that right, because I have made mistakes with that before, and Ortho4XP has done everything except give me the middle finger. So there you have it, guys. They are the three wave profiles that, as far as I'm aware, they're the only ones that exist within Ortho4XP. I'm pretty sure there's a fourth that's called plane, but that's exactly the same as not using a wave profile at all. At least that's how I understand it. But yes, if you obviously go back over your existing patch files and you look at all of the inclines that you have, and perhaps look at those runways through the elevation calculator that I already showed you, and just find where your zones are in your JOSM file, draw the line on the elevation calculator, and see exactly what kind of slope that is. You could just add a wave profile to your existing zones. You don't need to redo all of your runways. You can just find your inclines, add a wave profile if you feel like it's appropriate, reburn your tile, and just see the slightly improved character of your runway. What I'm going to do now is show you a little bit of footage of me essentially implementing that on the Jersey runway. The reason I chose Jersey, again, is because it was the tutorial airport that I used last year, so I thought for the purposes of obviously the comparison that's coming up later on, I thought it would be best to use the same runways we used last year, utilising the newer techniques that I'm using to actually create these patch files, so we can see the difference. So this is me executing all this. As you can see, I'm using all the parameters that I showed you in the video so far. I know it's a little bit fast, but you wouldn't want to sit here and watch me doing all of this. And of course, I'm now coming up to the end of the runway. I think it's time that we look at the comparison and see exactly how much more runway-like, real-world runway-like, these new tools enable us to make our runways. We'll start off at the very beginning. Last year, obviously, when I was showing you how to build tiles in part 1 of the tutorials, we went through how to build the tile, and of course the finished product was a flat runway. This is exactly what that looked like. In fact, this is footage from that video, so that because obviously I didn't want to reborn a tile with no profile, because that would just be a waste of time. As you can see there's no real world character to the runway whatsoever. It's just been completely flattened. Now this footage is also from last year's videos from part 2, and it shows what we did when we created the patch files. A significant improvement, as you can see. Obviously you can see here the change in slopes, change in gradients, and of course the differences between the flat areas and the incline areas of the runway, represented as close as we possibly could to the information that was given to us from the altitude.nu website, which is taking elevation information from the Google API, if I'm not mistaken, which is exactly the same place as the elevation calculator does as well. Some people don't think it's particularly accurate. Some people think it is in some places and is slightly off in other places, and I would agree with that. However, it is still the same information as we're using with the newest tools, and I wanted to try and kind of keep it consistent, as I didn't have any other source for elevation information within the UK. So taking these techniques and then applying, or should I say adding, the way profile parameters to the zones for the inclines in our patch files, and of course being able to put in real numbers, including decimal points, so that we can go between the meters instead of just going meter to meter to meter, we're able to create this. Now as you can see, it is significantly more detailed. It's also less aggressive looking, because of the fact that we have the ability to input more values. You know, like more values, like more measurements between meter to meter points, unlike, because we weren't able to do that in 2016, at least in June of 2016, last year anyway. We're able to essentially make the high points seem less like massive mountains compared to the rest of the runway, and make them look as they should, because we're able to put almost exactly the correct elevation information in for peaks of climbs, and of course the troughs of descents in the runway profile. On top of that, you'll find the differences between flat areas and the slopes are almost unable to be seen. There's almost no change in the angle to the naked eye until you start to see the slope as the incline starts to take effect. And that's all a result of the way profiles that we're using. We're rounding off all those things. We're giving the impression that, again, as I said, these runways, before they were built, the land was flattened as best it could be before the asphalt was laid down. That is how runways are constructed. You know, they don't just take a piece of land and just put asphalt on it, because it would be bumpy. It would not be smooth at all. The asphalt would be smooth, but then they would be limited by the smoothness of the foundation that they're building on, the land itself. So, you know, they try to flatten that out, and I think we've managed to capture that very well using these techniques. And I can tell you, like, landing like a dash 8 or something on this thing is fantastic, because especially if you use head shaking plugin along with Track IR, it's fantastic because you can see it doesn't look like jolts or like aggressive changes in the plane's attitude anymore when it's on the runway. It feels like it's oscillating. It feels like it's rolling, and you know that it feels also that the suspension is actually doing something in the plane's landing gear too. Now, I've never flown a plane before. I am, of course, running under the assumption that this is how it would be perceived in the real world. I know that there's also still information that I am lacking to be able to replicate these with any more detail than I am already. But I wanted to show you guys how my technique has evolved. You know, constantly struggle to bring as much realism to the X-Plane runway profiles using Ortho4XP scenery as I possibly can. And I think these skills and tools will help you a great deal as well. And as I said, if you've already made patch files, you don't need to redo them. All you need to do is go into them, make sure that your zones are in the right place, and then just add a wave profile if you believe that the character of the slope that you're capturing in that particular section of a runway warrants it. If it doesn't, leave it alone. But all you need to do is just add what needs to be added, where it needs to be added, reburn the tile, and then you'll have your new runway. I think these new techniques have completely changed how I perceive my standard of creating a runway and how I utilize the information I obtain from the internet to be able to obviously have data to put into JOSM to create these runway profiles. And it also allows me to kind of appreciate the subtleties of a runway profile rather than just having an elevation profile and that being the end of it. But overall, I hope that this information helps you to create the kind of runways that you want to make. I have been asked on a few occasions if I'm ever going to be releasing my scenery to the X-Plane community. Yes and no is the answer to that. No, because to actually upload all of my tiles, that's a lot of space. Hosting that would be incredibly expensive, something unfortunately financially I cannot actually make happen. However, I am completely focused on creating the runway patch files. At the moment, I'm running through the British runways. I've got about 47 done, I think. And a few of those are needing fixed. But once they're all finished, I will be uploading the pack of them to the X-Plane forums for people to utilize. They can download them, of course, put them into their own patches folder in Ortho4XP and just burn the files away themselves. I've also been asked how much it would cost. It is not going to be payware. I've never wanted it to be payware. I have got no problem at all with people contributing and perhaps donating to me so that I can obviously continue doing my runway profiles pretty much full time. As I do really enjoy doing it. It is fantastic fun. It's one hell of a challenge, but it's really, really great fun. And if you feel like you'd like to contribute towards that, I've got a link down below, like a donation link or something like that. If you want to contribute, feel free, but it is in no way expected. I'm still going to be making these patches, and of course, once I finish them, I'll be getting them to you guys on the X-Plane forums in packs per country. So once I finish Scotland, I'll be uploading the Scotland pack to X-Plane's forums. Once I've finished England and Wales and Ireland, I will, of course, upload the packs once they're ready. And then I'll move on to Europe, starting off with the Netherlands. So I've got quite a long roadmap, and it really is a very long roadmap. The only airports that I'm probably not going to be patching are grass airfields, because a lot of them are not actually recognised by Ortho4XP as aerodromes anyway, and so they're not flattened. Also, there's never really a conscious effort to flatten a grass, like a field runway, like an airfield, in the real world, and so it doesn't make much sense for me to, artificially put in like the smoothing with the runway profile. And I think also on a lower priority anyway than the actual airports and concrete airfields is military air bases. I will get them done eventually, but they're not a very high priority. If it's like a domestic airport or an international airport or even just a small airport that has a concrete runway, you can be guaranteed it will be getting patched. Of course, Ortho doesn't pick up all of these airfields itself, because obviously the OSM data doesn't always have aerodromes zones to signify that it is an airport. And so I am using the internet to make sure I'm catching all the ones that are being missed. If, however, I release a pack and there's still an airfield that is a concrete airfield that I haven't done, feedback on that would be fantastic, so that I can, of course, create the relevant patch file and get it ready for you. So to summarize, no, it's not payware, and yes, I will be uploading my patch files for my scenery to X-Plane forums. Sadly, I can't do complete tiles with all my custom zoom levels and stuff for you guys, because it's just far too big. But I think that's all I have to say for the moment regarding this. I hope you found it useful. I just want to give a big shout out to the game supporters of Alien Games, who of course funding me to create my content for YouTube. If of course you also enjoy the content and would consider funding the creation of it, feel free to check down below on the GameWisp link. There's more information down there to have a little bit of a read. Overall though, if you enjoyed the video, I'm glad. Consider giving it a like and perhaps sharing it with a friend who would also benefit from its information. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for future videos. Until I see you again, take care and goodbye.